Hello, everybody, and welcome to How Brain and Heart Create Whole Life Coherence. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Jerome Lubbe. And whether you're joining us from my side of the street or Dr. Jerome's side of the street, or the really happy median where a lot of our people come together, we're just really glad that you're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fun as long as we've known each other, Mike. This is the first time that we're actually doing a formal webinar together, and we're gonna in the nature of the way that we're both wired to jump right in. I think we'll give everybody maybe 60 to 90 seconds to come in, because we went from just a few people to a bunch of folks.
Oh, right.
So if you guys have in the chat, feel free to drop in where you're joining us from. Last time we had, I think, we had like 9 or 10 countries. It was kind of cool. It's fun to see how many people are from all over the place. So if you can, drop in there where you guys are coming from. But yeah, and also don't forget to hit reply to everyone, not just panelists. So yeah, and I just realized looking in my video that I felt like something was missing, and there it is. So Mike, what is the necklace that you're wearing, brother?
This is a necklace that a dear friend gave me, and it's based on the icon of Rublev's Trinity, or the hospitality of Abraham. This, oh gosh, I want to say 14th century Russian icon. Yeah.
That's awesome. We are going to see if we can enable the chat for everybody, because I offered for you to say hello and it looks like the chat is disabled. So cool. This is where we offer ourselves and each other grace, because we are all in the process of learning. Amy, would you be able to look at that on the back end? Are you able to? That's awesome. So we'll get you guys to say where you're coming from in a bit. We've got somebody, the ever illustrious Amy, is supporting us on figuring out how to turn that on. So yeah, so it's good to see you, Mike. Thank you for the chance to do this with you, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. And you think sufficient folks have arrived that we can dive right in, or?
Yeah, I think that'll be great.
Okay, cool. Well, if you're not familiar with me, my name is Mike Morrell, and I never know what to say in these kind of introductions, because I feel like we all have many different hats we wear, many different identities. I'm a dad of 2 amazing girls. I'm a writer, I'm a communicator. I work in spirituality publishing, and just love being able to communicate grounded and practical spirituality. One thing I like to say is, if it isn't practical, it isn't spiritual, it's just a good idea. And so I've been really privileged to kind of make up a vocation as I've went along for the last 20 or so years, getting to work in spirituality publishing, supporting authors and publishers with book launches, as well as doing my own blogging for the better part of 20 years. And, most of those archives are still up, perhaps to my detriment, but it's fun it's fun to be able to see the progression, of how ideas and insights are embodied, what I was concerned about at different points in time in my life, growing up in this sort of Christ-haunted, God-obsessed American South. Probably like a number of you tuning in, I grew up in a place that took our religion and our spirituality really seriously, which gave me both a lot of gifts as well as, more than a fair amount of trauma in the ways that certain things came out. But these days, love writing, communicating, and putting gatherings together, whether it's a small party or something like being able to help the Wild Goose Festival, which is a justice, arts, and spirituality festival that happens every summer in North Carolina, or Wisdom Camp, which is a contemplative inner spiritual day retreat that happens within the Wild Goose Festival. I just really enjoy exploring the different connections and the shared humanity that different people, discover, innovate, come across as we're on this journey to greater wholeness. And it's for this reason, well, it's one of many reasons that I really enjoy you, Jerome. I mean, you're a human being to me and not merely a human doing, but the things that you do are so catalytic to creating these kinds of connections that I'm really passionate about.
Thank you for sharing that, Mike. That's awesome. And we'll let you guys know who, if you're just joining, that we'll be able to give you an update on how Mike and I even know each other. But just wanted to segue quickly. One, thank you for Mike for sharing kind of your background and your story. Two, everybody who has joined us, we had a little bit of a hiccup on. I didn't realize I had the chat disabled, so my apologies on that. I've now discovered how to enable the chat, so I am learning in real time. This is practice and praxis, right? So thank you for all of you joining and sharing where you're from. We got California and Washington and Ontario. I'm curious to see, we had Germany and Denmark and a couple of things last time. So just drop in where you guys are from. And while you're doing that, I would love to share a little bit of who I am for those of you who don't know me, but you may be coming from a context or a container where you know Mike. But I tend to have a bit of a convoluted story of what I do now, kind of like Mike, in terms of making my own container in my own world. But I'm actually a South African born immigrant kid from Congo. My family immigrated to the States in the early 90s on asylum status as refugees. We don't look the part, but had a very interesting start. Immigrated with $100 and 2 suitcases. I have an identical twin brother, an older brother. I have a wife and 3 kids. And I have navigated the world in a couple of different buckets and a couple of different containers, from an undergrad in digital animation, special effects production, and film, into a music career with my brothers, into healthcare. And if you guys are wondering why in the world do you go from digital animation, film, to music, and then to healthcare, it's because realistically, I spent 9 years and over $100,000 going to over 20 specialists to get a diagnosis. And when I got that diagnosis, no one knew what to do with it. So I ended up essentially spending a small fortune in my early 20s without any other resources in the first, few years of a new marriage, trying to get an answer as to why I was having so many symptoms, primarily migraines and things called POTS and other things like that. But it turns out that there's nobody that really knows how to do rehab and wellness with complicated cases. A lot of folks handle complex cases from a triage standpoint. A lot of folks are happy to do wellness and rehab for a non-complex case, but the idea of doing wellness and really healthy lifestyle for a complex case, it's kind of a limbo zone. It's a twilight zone for us as patients. So I was stuck in this purgatory of sorts, not only as somebody who had a spiritual background that told me if I prayed hard enough and I tried hard enough, I'd get better. And Mike knows I've been anointed in enough oil to bathe a cow and never got rid of any of my migraines. But how do I reconcile what I believe about my spirituality and separate that from the poor kind of explanations that I got from clinicians and also spiritual leaders in pastoral care? So long story short, I became the doctor that I couldn't find. And now I run a private practice in Atlanta. And we've been working out of this space for 8 years, working with complex unresolved cases, which is my own personal story, which is where we're going to kind of jump into how Mike and I intersect with how does the film student / musician become a doctor, and how do you intersect that with everything that, and any of you who are coming from Mike's space, his expertise has such breadth and depth. So we're going to see if we can connect some dots on both of our fairly disparate and convoluted pasts into something coherent, one would say, right? So that'll be fun. And thanks for everybody who let us know where you guys are coming in from.
Yeah, all kinds of different places here. It's really awesome to see y'all streaming in. Yeah, I guess you and I have met, what was it, 2015, 2016, somewhere around in there. It was through a friend of a friend who had gotten Dr. Jerome an advanced copy of this book, which I got to contribute to with Father Richard Rohr, called The Divine Dance, the Trinity, and Your Transformation. And so I get this email from this guy, and he's like, hey, I came across this advanced copy of the book, and I'd love to sit down and talk to you about the correspondences I see between neuroscience and neurobiology and the Trinity. And, in my line of work, let's just say that I sometimes get some interesting requests from interesting people. And I don't always have time to respond to everybody, having a family and work and such. But this one stuck out to me. I was like, this sounds pretty interesting. And he was very graciously willing to come to Raleigh, where I lived at the time in North Carolina. But I saw that he was based in Atlanta, and I said, well, no need. I have family in Atlanta, and I'm going to be there soon. So So we met up at Dancing Goats in Decatur. And Dr. Jerome did some back of napkin drawings that were quite impactful for me. And you can go into the details of those if you want to. But the bottom line for me was that I was really intrigued by the correspondences he was drawing between the parts and the functions of the brain and how they interact with this peculiar Christian idea of Trinity, where we proclaim the oneness of God, but we say that that oneness is not an undifferentiated monad, but instead is found within this interrelationship between these different persons, between this kind of dynamism, or the ancient Greek word perichoresis, this kind of circle dance. And seeing those correspondences, I was intrigued, and we stayed in touch. And before too long, we began seeing Dr. Jerome, my whole family, in a clinical context, as well as continuing to stay in touch in the world of spirituality gatherings and just hanging out.
Yeah. No, that was one of the. I appreciate you sharing your experience, because it's always funny to hear. I joke around with folks because I'm a bit uninclined to unsolicitedly reach out to people that I haven't seen in person. Like, I'm super comfortable with doing it when I'm in front of you, because then I can get the social relationship, I can get the body language, I can get all these other things. But to reach out to somebody and solicit a meeting that I've never met, it was actually thoroughly entertaining, because I went, I'm going to send this guy an email. And I know that he's covering a lot of topics. And I didn't know at the time how much of your work is intersected in all of these different places that we have common ground on. But I went, how do I email this guy and say, I think I can use the brain to reconcile the concept of the Trinity and like actually everything in the world based on how the brain works. I think you can actually use it as a model for how everything works. And I go, how do I email somebody that and not sound like I have the highest opinion of myself? So it's great, man. But for those of you who don't know, I didn't mention this in my work, but clinically, I am one of only 2 doctors in Atlanta that are board certified in what's known as functional neurology. It's myself and actually my clinical associate. So it's us. There's 9 in the States. It's about 300 in the country, 600 in the world. And basically what we do is we take a complex case and go, hey, can we rehab something without drugs or surgery, from a stroke to a head injury to a concussion to nonverbal autism, fill in the blank. If somebody's above ground and we want their brain to work better, can we do that kind of like tuning a piano, but you're tuning the brain? It's like being a personal trainer for the brain. So when I learned about functional neurology, I got introduced to some of these concepts around like these areas of intelligence, like not taking the old model of you are a left brain person or you are a right brain person, because if that's the case, then what happened to the other half of your brain, right? But in this situation, going, oh, there's a huge seat of role and responsibility in the brain. And there are these really, really kind of huge intelligence centers in the brain of thinking, feeling, and doing. And then you start to look around the world and you go, gosh, how many spiritual traditions and how many physics components and how many everyday examples do we see that show up in triads? Neutrons, electrons, and protons, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Fill in the blank with whatever it may be, not just an ethos piece, but this idea of what Mike was talking about with perichoresis and how things intersect. Even the basics of a family unit, 2 parents and an offspring, right? There's always this idea of what it looks like to have a relationship with more than one thing or more than 2 things, to move past a binary into a non-binary, into a triadic relationship. And then going, yeah, I think the way that we understand the brain's function, its roles and responsibility, what if we use that metaphor in that container to kind of use it as a framework to ask questions like, what do we do with brain coherence? What do we do with finding a work-life balance, which is kind of a myth that doesn't really exist? We've got to change our language around that. So when Mike and I met, I was actually walking distance from my clinic. And I just finished with a session with a nonverbal autistic child who, after about 6 months, has started speaking, but his nickname is Barbarian. Because when we would work together. I do pretty intense work to help people get into their body and kind of work through resilience, like help people navigate what it feels like to be uncomfortable. And when he started to talk, and he really switched on at about 7 years old, and the speech just came flooding in, his favorite thing to say was, "You are a barbarian. You are not a nice man," which was thoroughly entertaining because he didn't want to do the work, and that was his way of communicating that he didn't want to be there. So I had just gone from a conversation where this person liked to refer to me as affectionately as barbarian, and I sat down with Mike and said, "Hey, can I draw this out on a napkin, and you tell me if I'm crazy?" And fortunately, in that conversation, Mike had the opportunity to legitimately look at me and go, "This is nonsensical." And he didn't. He said, "This is wild. I don't understand it completely, but I know intrinsically it makes sense. And if I had $1 for every time somebody said it makes sense, I'm just going to need some time to understand it." And that's hopefully the goal of this conversation with you guys today, is we can make sense of things and also help you to understand it in terms of where you use it and integrate it in your life. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just waiting. I'm seeing if your video froze, Mike. Let's see. Thanks for everybody checking in. And what I would like for you to do while we're waiting for Mike's video to come back, if anybody else can comment, if it's just me, maybe it's my internet, or if you've lost Mike as well. But what I would also love for you to do is, if you guys can use the Q&A section, if you have, no worries, everybody, that sounds great. I assumed that was the case. We'll wait for him to come back. Everybody take a deep breath. This is where we get the opportunity to make sure that, one of the phrases that we use in my world is that there are no bears, right? There's an opportunity to be able to make sure that if we lose Mike for a few seconds, it's going to be okay. His internet will reload.
Here
We'll
I
be
am.
all right. So yeah, so thanks for making it back, Mike. That's good.
Yeah.
And I was just telling everybody, if throughout this conversation, because I won't be monitoring the chat, just to let you guys know, we've got a great friend of ours, my creative director, Amy, is going to be monitoring the chat or the Q&A. If you have a particular question that you would like for Mike and I to answer, if you would do me a favor and specifically drop it into the Q&A, it's at the bottom of the taskbar, then Amy will monitor those and send it to Mike and I, so we can make sure to answer those questions, hopefully when we have some time at the end. Okay. So Mike, we good? Are you back? Can we hear you?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can, man. Sounds
Okay,
great.
beautiful. Not sure what happened with my internet there. Hopefully that will not happen again, but
that's okay, man. That's okay.
yeah.
We were just chatting about how we have a chance to take a deep breath and everything's okay. It's going to work out. So
Exactly.
so I'm curious for you, man. One of the things that I was going to ask about, Mike, is, we had this idea of coherence and whole life coherence, and sometimes that can feel a bit esoteric in terms of what does that mean. So I'm
Yeah.
curious, just in the context and the container that we're going to navigate over the next bit of time with everybody, what does that look like for you for whole life coherence, and also what it looks like for us to have life out of order or in order, so to speak? What does that look like and feel like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, like you said a moment ago, that the notion of work-life balance is kind of a myth. It's kind of a misnomer. There's no such thing as this sort of perfect Zen-like balance. But the idea of the triadic structure of reality, to me, is about, I'm going to call it a catalytic asymmetry. In other words, it's not this sort of perfect yin yang sort of situation, but it's like we're always dancing. We're hopping on one foot to the other and hopefully doing it in a rhythm that actually makes sense, which for me often looks like recognizing, just taking a non-judgmental snapshot of how I'm showing up in a given moment or a given season of time, sort of somatically, mentally, relationally, with my loved ones, with those that I serve vocationally. And usually that's a combination of ideally taking inventory and celebrating where I've come from, the things that feel really good and settled and working, but it also ends up bringing up areas that have room for improvement. And so if that's like, pole one, then pole two is stretching into those areas where there's room for improvement, which we'll probably be spending a lot of time today talking about: how to practice self-care, how to practice contemplatively, how to practice sharing love with ourselves and giving and receiving love to those around us in a sort of stretching place. And then there's this sort of third pole where in some ways it's a lot like the first, but it's in a new iteration. It's the new equilibrium that's happened and the new asymmetry that's happened. So it never ends, but there is ideally directionality to it. So I kind of liken it to a spiral. It's neither a linear progression from glory to glory, but nor is it a vicious cycle where I feel like nothing is changing. And I can just really see how that has showed up in my life. My interest in practical spirituality is because I grew up in a very religious household, and as a kind of denominational mutt in Southern Baptist and Pentecostal and Presbyterian settings. And it's interesting when we think about perhaps the three traditional centers of the Enneagram or the Gurdjieff work. In a lot of ways, the Presbyterian world, for those of you who are familiar with, evangelicalism and conservative Protestantism, was a very mind-oriented kind of movement and group of people that were trying to think their way through spirituality. And the Pentecostal world was a very heart-oriented, wanting to feel the presence of God, seeking catharsis, seeking ecstasy. And the Southern Baptists were the doers. They were the ones putting their bodies on the line for their evangelism projects, the things they were wanting to do. And so they all had like a little piece of something that maybe could have been helpful, but I found them all to be kind of half-baked in their overemphasis on their skill set, as well as the incredible hubris of feeling like they were the only game in town. And meanwhile, I struggled with things like panic attacks, strong generalized anxiety. What I later learned was vertigo and various phobias around travel. And so similar to you, Jerome, I felt like there was this sort of disconnect between the aspirations of my faith and my lived experience. The Pentecostals wanted to pray it out of me. The Presbyterians said if I memorized more Bible verses that I would start to feel better. But none of that was working. So I began seeking, something that would help me gain this greater coherence. Again, not as a destination, but as a dance.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing that is so important for us to name in these kind of containers, is that there's so many different things that make up our life, right? So for instance, if what was just shared in the chat there, like in these particular spaces, what happens if you're coming in and out of significant parts of your life in this disorientation? What do you do when you end up finding this particular thing that you're like, I don't understand how to navigate? Something feels like it's out of alignment, or something feels like it's not working, right? So when we talk about this high level topic of whole life coherence, I want you to just think about, is there anything in my life that doesn't make sense? Is there anything in my life that isn't working? Is there anything in my life that feels confusing or clumsy, right? And what I hear when you're talking about that, Mike, is it's like you and I have both spent a lifetime, which we'll share a couple of individual stories of kind of what my story is as a patient, and you shared a little bit there of what it looks like for us to have this idea of there's so many things that are confusing. I just need a little bit of an orientation. I just need a little bit of an anchor. So I want you guys to think about when we talk about whole life coherence, your whole life, we're talking about wholeness, right? We're talking about everything that makes you who you are. We're talking about the idea of coherence being something like a harmony, or something like coherence is synonymously balance and harmony and symmetry. So I want you guys to think about this as me coming from a musician's standpoint, right? Even if you're not a musician, okay? If you went to an orchestra, how many instruments are in an orchestra? It's not a 3-piece band. It's not a 5-piece band. You may have 100 instruments on stage, right? Those instruments are structurally in great shape. They're functionally tuned. They're playing a particular song, and then all of a sudden what you end up seeing is that if somebody plays something just at the wrong time, or they play it in just the wrong sequence, what ends up happening? Even you being in the audience, do you know when something feels out of alignment? Do you know when something's not right in terms of timing? And somebody could be playing the right thing, but at the wrong speed. So what I mean by that is when we're looking at this whole thing called our life, I want to back up for just a second, translate some of what Mike was talking about into something that all of us experience, which is, how are we thinking? How are we feeling? And what are we doing? Right? What does our thought life look like? What does our emotional health look like? What does our physical health look like? So in this space, if you're going, man, I'm trying to figure out how to have coherence. You're saying, I'm trying to figure out how to make things work together. I'm trying to figure out how to get harmony. Because in my world as a patient and in the world as a doctor serving the patients that I see, what happens when nothing shows up structurally? All the advanced imaging shows you're fine. And everybody goes, I don't get it. It's no point that you shouldn't feel this way. Or then somebody does all the lab work or somebody does all the functional tests and they go, but everything's coming back normal. But the person is going, God, my life feels so out of order. It feels so uncomfortable, right? When we're in these spaces and we're going, I know that it looks like I'm fine. And it looks like when I go to the doctor, or I go to my pastor, or I go to my friends, or I go to that person who's counsel, that I look fine and everything appears to be working, but everything feels so out of sync. So when we talk about coherence, I want you to think harmony or sync. And here's an idea. And I'd love, Mike, after I share this example, I'd love to hear an example of where things over the last couple of years, especially the nature of COVID and the nature of the last couple of years and just your journey as a person, where it felt like some things were significantly out of sync, where there was a lot of disharmony, and either you're still navigating that because all of us are human and Mike and I are not here to tell you that we got it all figured out, or you recognize that something wasn't just right, it wasn't in sync, and how did you navigate getting some harmony and getting some of those things to line up? But one of the phrases that I want you guys to think about, just to summarize this, when we talk about whole life coherence or harmony or sync or symmetry and balance, is one of the phrases that I tell my patients is that actual walking, physical walking, is nothing more than a controlled series of falls. We just got used to it, right? But walking, if you stop thinking about walking, you stop walking, you actually fall down. Okay. So walking is nothing more than a controlled series of falls, and pretty much everything else in life is too. So when we're working about trying to figure out this coherence, looking at our mental, emotional, physical, relational, and if it applies to you, your spiritual health, we're trying to figure out, how do I shift from balance to rhythm? How do I make sure that as I'm walking and I feel like I'm stumbling in this thing called life, that maybe it's a case of actually changing pace. Maybe it's a case of changing how long I walk for, but life is a controlled series of falls. We're just trying to figure out how to fall less often. And if we fall, that we don't injure ourselves, if that makes sense. So I'm curious for you, Mike, when you've looked at the last couple of years, when has it felt like it's out of sync? Is it still out of sync, or is there anything that you've seen come into alignment that feel better for you?
Yeah, so it's a wonderful question. Obviously the pandemic beginning in 2020 is a good reference point for when a lot of us began feeling additional stresses in our lives. And it, certainly wasn't the beginning of stresses. But for me, it was actually 2019. In 2019, for some reason, I began feeling just really debilitating lack of energy, kind of a strong sense of depression for the first time in my life. I could barely get out of bed. I was having panic attacks every few days. And like without even trying, I kind of lost my appetite, and I just lost 30 pounds, which is not me. Normally, releasing that kind of weight takes tremendous effort. And I just knew that something wasn't right. And I began, doing several things simultaneously to try to get back into more coherence. Certainly was having conversations with you. I was beginning to see locally in Asheville, where I live, a somatic experiencing therapist. And it's interesting, just like sometimes in religion, we can have if everything is, if we have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And so it's like pray things away. I was, going through these different approaches, which were valuable and were yielding some results. But then I made a discovery, which was that I was having really high levels of toxic mold exposure. And so I was like, oh, okay. I'm in this environment that's literally, messing with my brain and my body chemistry in this very debilitating way. So,
Yeah.
we got mold remediation, got things cleaned out. And then the things, exercises that you were giving me, exercises my somatic experiencing therapist were giving me, suddenly really were making a lot more sense. And not only that, but by the end of 2019, working with some vagus nerve exercises and some inner ear strengthening exercises, I effectively vanquished panic attacks, something I'd been struggling with for nearly 20 years. Nowadays, I might have 1 or 2 panic attacks a year, whereas I was having 2 and 3 a week there for a while. And so it was
Can we just
incredible.
celebrate? Can we just celebrate that for a second? Right, because that's monumental. Because I will tell you guys in honesty, I made Mike drive in the car with me because I wanted to see how well he was doing and to see how much work this man has put in to becoming healthy, to even be willing to let me drive him. So much gratitude and so much appreciation for the work, man. Because to overcome panic attacks is that's not supposed to be possible, right? Not if they're so consistent. So congrats. I just want to take a minute and celebrate that. That's awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't know if this is an appropriate time to share now or share later, but I've considered, because one of the things that you teach is the value of the practice of gratitude. And sometimes I can only be fixated on the areas where I have room to grow. And I forget the ways in which I actually have grown. And so I actually took a little inventory before we got on here, where I was sort of thinking about things that have felt previously immovable in my life that I have overcome, but then also in transparency, the areas of growth that I still have. So at some point, let me know if you'd like to hear those, because I think it could be valuable to sort of hear a real world example of, how this can work in practice.
Yeah, and I think now is actually a great time to share that, Mike, because I mean, I think one of the things that I have a personal aversion to, and I know that you and I have talked about it, and this is kind of one of those cool containers because we have a safe space with our history to invite 145 of our friends to listen to us share a dialogue.
Yeah.
That oftentimes you and I are considered respective leaders in our space. We're content developers. We have a voice in these spaces that people clearly have jumped onto a webinar and are taking time out of their day. And one of the things that I have found is lacking is that so rarely do you have somebody leading a conversation that is communicating transparently that they don't have it all figured out, that they don't have it together.
Yeah.
I will share an example of what happened in the last 24 hours with me personally as a patient. That is both an indication of how much work I've done and how much work there is still to do. I'll do that in a minute. But yeah, to create a container where folks can listen to us share how we've navigated this, how we've made it work. Because realistically, most people don't need a hero. They just need a believable example they can follow, because our brain is hardwired using what's called a mirror neuron system to see someone else do something. And that's how we learn to speak. That's how we learn to walk. That's how we get our accent. Why do people sound like they're from Northern Tennessee and then all of a sudden they sound like they're from Chicago, right? It's like, depending on what you've seen around your world is what you learn. So if you don't see someone modeling that they aren't just having a conversation with you about what works. In fact, it's the coherence, it's the collective whole of what is hard, what is not, what is working, what is missing. So yeah, that's exactly what this container is for. Is for us to be in whatever you feel safe and whatever you feel led to share. Yeah, I'd love to hear an example of what you just stepped into there, and give us a chance to hold that space and be present to that.
Absolutely. But were you about to share something from the past 24 hours? Did I miss that?
Yeah, I got a rewind button in my brain, so I'm gonna hold it. It's also me gating because it's probably gonna get emotional. That's the way I am. So I'm gonna hear your story and then I'll
Okay.
share my story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm also, we won't talk about the Enneagram a lot today, guys, but I'm also very, very high as a social too. So me taking over Mike's space and hijacking it, I will feel bad about that for the next 2 days. So, so Mike,
Well,
I would love to hear what you were going to share, man.
I see this as a collaborative we space, but sure, I can go ahead
Yeah,
and
no, that's great.
share first.
Yeah, man.
As I moved from my teens into my 20s and became more aware of certain habitual ways in which I was showing up that I felt like were holding me back. That was when I began to take an interest in things like centering prayer and other modalities of spirituality. But to first share some of the things that are no longer an issue for me, but that were, that I started recognizing in my late teens and early 20s, and in many ways persisted throughout my 20s and throughout a lot of my 30s. Those were, panic attacks, strong generalized anxiety, what I began to see as debilitating vertigo. And certain travel related phobias, such as, one day when I was on a road trip with a good friend of mine, my high school best friend, and it was, I guess we were both 19, and we were driving from Atlanta, where I lived at the time, to Tampa, Florida. Suddenly, when I was driving with him, I felt like I was piloting a rocket ship, and I just felt so disoriented. I began having tunnel vision, just this incredible tension in my neck and shoulders, began hyperventilating, and I had to pull over. Like I just couldn't do it. And that was the first instance of that. And gradually, it was like my circle began drawing closer and closer around me, to where even short interstate trips around town were no longer possible. Just the feeling of cars coming up behind me, everything just felt like it was going a mile a minute. It was overwhelming, and I didn't feel capable anymore. And so that diminished function, of interstate driving lasted, well over a decade. And gradually, through doing regular contemplative exercises, through doing the sorts of exercises I learned from Jerome and from others, like I said, I no longer have consistent panic attacks. I no longer have strong generalized anxiety. Even the most recent one to fade in the last few months has been the vertigo. And that's just been super incredible. And I didn't even realize it at first, which is what's amazing to me. This persistent sense that was first brought to my attention by my somatic experiencing therapist, where she said, what your body often codes as anxiety, I think it actually starts as like a physical sense of disequilibrium. And I began to realize that she was right, and began to take steps to be more consciously aware of that. And it's begun to go away. Now, there are elements that I still struggle with. And, to Jerome's point, like, just because I write books on the spiritual life with Richard Rohr, just because I podcast and I host, video dialogues like this, I think there's a strong addiction in our culture these days to image and to the idea of flawlessness. And it's not true. No one you admire is actually has it all together. And I personally trust leaders a lot more when we're honest about where we're still struggling. So the reality is I still have some travel related phobias. Like lately I can drive myself on the interstate just fine, but adding a passenger to the mix still has me hypervigilant in some ways that I'm still struggling to understand. I've been having issues getting proper rest lately. I've always gone to bed too late, working from home, having children around 1:30 to 2:30 a.m. bedtime. But lately, if I've been waking up at say 7 to go use the bathroom, my mind races when I get back, and I haven't been able to go back to sleep. That's been a really recent thing. And then, the most complex thing is me discovering areas of my own neurodivergence. In the last couple of years, getting diagnosis of sensory processing disorder, for instance, and ADHD, and possibly autism spectrum disorder, and grappling with the subtleties of these paradigms, these understandings, and how they impact the relationships that mean the most to me. Oftentimes I can mask, I can present, I can be high functioning in many environments. But even this past week, I was spending some time in close proximity to a dear friend for days on end, and she gave me some very, tender but direct feedback of like, wow, you actually are putting out a lot of like this kind of anxious presence and kind of hyper fixation and hyper focus on me. And I know it's coming from a place of care and concern for me, but it actually, your energy feels intrusive. And so it's like, wow, hearing feedback like that shows me that I still have room to grow, both in my understanding and in my practice.
Yeah. And thank you for naming that, man. And also agreeing with David, the courage and the authenticity to share it. Because I think this is the thing. It's like, I mean, if you think realistically about the years of work that you've done, we talk about doing the work, and you're in a space that they actually call it the work, full, upper cap.
Yes.
That it's one of those things where we're talking about doing the work. You're talking about how many years of focused work have you done? Right, probably 20.
Yeah, 20 if we're counting, beginning with therapy and beginning with,
Yeah,
focused spiritual work. You're referring to fourth way
yeah,
or career shift work. Yeah, 20 years total in various forms. And
yeah,
it's sometimes, honestly, it feels discouraging. I'm like, what has even, occurred? What benefits have even
mm,
happened? And that's why it's so important for me to have that list of things like, no, actually in this column, I'm not experiencing those things anymore, or not
yeah,
on any regular basis. So,
yeah,
okay, thank God. And
yeah.
there's all this other stuff. It never ends in a certain way.
Totally. And I appreciate your story and your examples, because I'll share an example of what happened with me in just a moment. But for everybody that's listening, I want you to shift your appreciation of kind of the container that Mike and I are talking about a bit here, to just think about your relationship with driving, or your relationship with travel, whether you know how to drive, whether you don't drive, whether you ride a bike or you walk or you use a wheelchair, regardless of your current level of ability or your difference in ability or your access to transport, right? We all move around the world. Even if I work with a quadriplegic patient, they can still move their eyes. We all have a relationship with movement, right? So when Mike is talking about those things and I'm experiencing his story, and I can so significantly relate to, God, I would just like this to stay a part of my history. It's one of those things that when we have been driving effectively for 20 years, and you think about the sheer volume of drives, the sheer volume of minutes, the sheer trips and travel that you've done quantitatively, right? Not qualitatively, just volume.
Mhm.
How many accidents have you really had? How many times have you actually run out of gas, right? How many times have you actually run late? Those sort of things. Why I say that is oftentimes we forget to take into consideration how much ground we've covered, and then we focus on, I ran out of gas. I shouldn't be dealing with this issue, or I got stressed about this particular drive. I'm in Atlanta, y'all. And you see, I said y'all. My issue that happened yesterday was specifically related to Atlanta traffic. And I have been navigating Atlanta traffic for 20 years. I'm very, very skilled at it, but it doesn't mean that something may not happen in that particular example, because you've got to realize every single time that we encounter the present moment, it's the first and only time we will ever encounter it, right? That's the only time we've ever encountered that present moment. So everything that's happened up to that point informs us, but it doesn't define us. And we're looking at these spaces and going, do I have permission to give myself the grace that I have done so well? I've covered so much ground. And sometimes things happen that I didn't expect.
Mhm.
I went onto autopilot and I might have changed lanes and bumped into somebody, or made a bad decision, jumped out a little early in conversation and caused a little bit of a head on collision with a friend. Like, what is our relationship with what it looks like to navigate the world and give ourselves credit for how much ground we've covered? And in the world of neuropsych, and I'll give you a couple of bullet points quickly, but in the world of neuropsych, we're not going to be able to go into the weeds of all of the things that we could cover from, interpersonal neurobiology and the brain-based enneagram and polyvagal theory. All of those things will be other webinars that Mike and I can do.
Mhm.
Um, but the reality is that in these situations, we're trying to go, can I step back and just keep coming back to this idea of wholeness as it relates to my brain and my body? My brain is connected to my body. My brain, my psychology informs my somatic experience. My somatic experience, this body informs what happens to me in terms of how I think and feel. So a really easy way to think about this long term is, even in what Mike is sharing, is if you're listening to what he's sharing and listening to what I'm sharing, and you start to drift off and say it's not making any sense anymore, then you're starting to lose coherence in your thoughts. So you're aware, hey, this experience is a little bit out of rhythm with my way of thinking. What does it look like to come back into alignment? Is it taking a deep breath and coming back into my body? Or Mike shares something like that and it resonates with you and you're like, oh gosh, that really lands for me. That hits me emotionally. Now you're harmonizing with him. You're getting coherence with him emotionally in that emotional center. Or I share a story with you, or Mike shares a story with you about panic attacks. And it's like, gosh, I feel that. I feel my throat tighten up. I feel my stomach get uncomfortable. So as we're having these conversations, just keep checking in. What's your relationship to what you're thinking, what you're feeling in your heart space emotionally, and what's happening in your body? And if you haven't done that before, then there's resources that we can kind of talk about at the end, Dr. Siegel, that Jen just mentioned for sure. But there's things that we'll talk about. But for this container, this is more of a space for us to give you more of a narrative or more of a storytelling version than all of the individual nuances of particular approaches, if that makes sense. It's a personal version of a very complex conversation, right? So that being said, here is an example for me of something that happened. I will use myself as a clinical case, because one of the things that we wanted to be able to do is, and this is a great segue into that, was to share with you guys, how do we do a self-care journey and have it be tangible, have it be tactile, how you feel like you're getting traction, how do you feel like you're making progress. And one of the biggest things that I've learned in my journey as a patient, I mean, my entire world is known as the patient doctor. I'm not only patient with you in a clinical setting, but I also happen to be a patient every day I wake up, first and foremost. And how do I think through the idea of making self-care sustainable, and having this idea of wholeness in my life? And one of the biggest things that I think we have an opportunity to do is give ourselves the space and the opportunity to go, sometimes it doesn't work and sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes it doesn't work and it is an opportunity for you to go, hey, how could I do that differently? So I want you to think of this story that I'm going to give you as a person, if you're a patient, as a parent or a partner, whatever you hold in terms of your social location and your story. But I want you to think about this statement of, based on my current understanding, what could I do differently? And if I had that question and I'm sitting presently in my conversation about my own journey with self-care, can I give myself the grace to go, sometimes in the moment, I don't know what to do, but based on my current understanding, what could I do differently? And I'll give you a story as an example, okay? So Amy's in the room with me. We did a trip to Nashville on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, to work on the next basically 50 years of content. It's the way my brain works. So I'm trying to practically go, what does it look like to get all of the things that are in my system that are bursting at the seams into the world? We're coming back from Nashville, and I'm feeling pretty symptomatic as a person. For those of you who don't know, I've averaged 8 to 10 full-blown migraines per calendar month, not calendar year. I wrestle with what's called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which basically means that if I go from a seated or a laying position to a standing position, my heart rate will increase sometimes as much as 60 points. My resting heart rate can oftentimes on a good day be around 90, and on a bad day be 120. My system gets pushed through a lot. I got run over by a car when I was 8, had 4 head injuries after that, 2 in high school, 2 after high school. I was hit by a drunk driver not once, but twice. And my brain and my body have been through some things. So I've been navigating this container that's got some structural deficits, and some compromised spaces. And I made a mistake yesterday that I don't normally make that was very consequential. I was driving down 75. For those of you who know Atlanta, we had a huge interchange. And I decided to, at really stop and go traffic, it was at a full stop. I decided to get onto a different interstate to make a change. But I made that decision at the very spot. I was that guy. I never do this. Again, I never do this. So I give myself the grace to know it's an outlier. It probably won't happen again. But I decided, let me get on this. But it was at a point where the only way that I could change was, where everybody's at a full stop, was that I had to look all the way over my shoulder behind me at the cars that were coming. And then as I'm looking behind me to make sure that I can take off and merge into traffic, I accelerated as I'm turning my head to full rotation, and I took off. And as I took off, immediately I lost hearing in my right ear. I lost part of my vision. And I ended up basically taking an 8-hour process that I normally have for a migraine, of a start, an on-ramp, a build-up, the process, and then it stops. And I consolidated it into basically a 4-minute window. And what ended up happening, and I appreciate Mike's eyebrows all the way to the ceiling, because Mike doesn't know this story. I mean, he's hearing it for the first time too, is as I'm going through this experience, the clinician in me kicks in. It's kind of Jill Bolte Taylor, A Stroke of Insight, if you guys haven't read the book. Fantastic book. She has a stroke and is fully aware that she's having a stroke because it happened in the part of her brain that affected her body, but not her clarity of thought. And as I'm going through this, I realize that I'm having what's called a TIA, which is a transient ischemic attack. And a transient ischemic attack is like an acute stroke. It's like a traffic jam. The highway didn't blow up like a normal stroke. It didn't get shut down like a normal stroke. It had a traffic jam. And I've had this happen about 4 or 5 times in my life. And when it happened yesterday, let's just say that the bottom properly fell out. And the degree of symptoms that I had and the degree of things that I'm working through in my body at the moment with 20 years of practice at compartmentalizing what I experience have been profound. It's been very intense. And the thing that I had to do when I woke up this morning was give myself the opportunity to go, the reason yesterday worked out as well as it did is because of the 20 years of work that I've done. If I hadn't done the 20 years of work that I'd done, if that was the first time that it had happened to me, the experience would have been completely different, right? Then I get the opportunity to go, based on my current understanding, what would I do differently? I can tell you, I promise you, I will never take that exchange on the highway again. But also I had to have a hard conversation with my wife this morning about, we've got so many things in place to make sure that we're taken care of if anything catastrophic happens to me. But now we've got to make sure that she understands what to do if I have a stroke, because the type of migraines that I experience give me a much higher probability of having a stroke. That's just a part of the equation for me, right? So I have to be in a place where I both hold that I've done good work, that yesterday was really hard, that I don't have guarantees of what happens next. But with what I have in front of me and what I have available, what am I doing with my mental health and reconciling anxiety that happens because of that and my fear of what happens next? How do I find some harmony and some coherence and some collective stability in my emotional health? Because it's so fatiguing that one of the things that I would say anecdotally, but it's very true, is that 90% of depression is actually fatigue until proven otherwise. That if you felt rested, you wouldn't feel the same way. So when I have that happen last night and I'm completely out of gas, and I wake up this morning and I'm completely out of gas, I have to have a conversation with myself emotionally and go, am I depressed or am I tired? Or is it both? And then I check in with my body and I go, where's my physical health? Am I safe? Am I stable? What do I need to do to make sure that the people around me have what they need in case something happens to me, right? Because I can't move through my world with the expectation that that isn't on the table as a potential. Am I forecasting it as a probability? No. Do I know that I have an increased probability? Yes. So do I perseverate on it and I fixate on it and I become a self-fulfilling prophecy? No. Do I want to name that I'm concerned about it, but I don't want it to become anxiety? Yes. Do I get to name in my heart space that I'm very disappointed? Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really hard to go through the world and do all of the work that Mike is talking about and all the work that I'm talking about. And then you have a really, really, really difficult day. That is a profoundly difficult thing to do as a human being. So how do we hold this space and go, I'm going to breathe. I'm going to check in. I'm going to take care of myself in this moment. I'm going to do one deep breath, which is on the hat, and tell myself, based on my current understanding, what would I do differently? And I get to say, you know, what I would do differently is I wouldn't criticize myself. I wouldn't blame myself for what happened. I would celebrate the fact that it went as well as it could have, and it gave me some insights that I can do differently. And now you get to see this opportunity of where's my head space, where's my heart space, and where's my body space. And then all of those things align and they check in to come into coherence with each other. And I think the key is in this space, to really drive the point home for all of you. This is not about, like, the work of self-care and the work of whole life coherence is not about hurting less. It's about recovering faster, right? Like, yesterday hurt a lot physically from a pain standpoint. I'm still dealing with a lot of pain right now. And from a visual perspective, it doesn't look like it, but as long as Mike has known me, for me to be emotional in a space, I'm working through a lot of pain. That's what I'm working through, because I can normally buffer it, but I'm at a different threshold today. So one of the things that I really want to lean into in these stories and in these spaces is understanding these relationships around wholeness is not that somebody's going to sell you this really piss poor idea about a 21-day version of becoming a better you. We're trying to increase this idea of awareness and increase self-awareness around, if I'm hurting, how do I recover faster, versus I don't want to ever hurt again. Because if that's the case, I can't promise you that. Mike can't promise you that, right? But we do want to help you recognize that based on my current understanding, what can I do differently? Can I name what's hurting? Can I name what's working? And can I recognize that it isn't about hurting less, it's about recovering faster, right? So
why don't we practice what you're preaching, Jerome, for a moment, and let's take a deep breath and just sit with everything that you just shared with us. Yeah, that's really real. I feel like I was right there with you at that interchange and that split-second decision you made, and how fast both of our minds work, how like you immediately knew what you were doing as it was occurring to you. And that your thought afterwards was not only the incredible pain that you were in, but how does this impact your family? How does this impact those you love?
yeah,
Recognizing
absolutely.
that resilience
Thank you.
that you've sown into over these last couple decades. And it isn't about these things never happening, but it's about how do we recover? What's our next step? And what's our next step? Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So thank you for the chance to invite you guys into, conversations that don't commonly happen, which is teachers going, hey, we're teaching you how to take care of yourself. And look, we're actually in the process of self-care. Imagine that, right? It's like the thing that drives crazy. Yeah.
A live demonstration.
Yeah. And it's the thing that drives me crazy. I always joke with folks, if you're in clinical practice and you're not getting your own therapy, that's malpractice. Like, you should be under care if you're giving other people care. It's a terrible idea. That most of people that are in the self-care, self-help space, which mine is shifting into self-care, not self-help, is it's so much of this idea of somebody arriving. And that's the idea of saying, oh, I've eaten so much food, I don't need to eat anymore. You're like, every single day that you are above ground, you are going to have to take care of yourself with some basics. Okay. So talking about taking care of yourself, what we want to do for the next section, because everybody's different. Some people may be on the call and be like, I'm totally available to wherever you guys take me. Some of you may be, I left 45 minutes ago, I'm going to watch the replay and I'm going to hit pause when I try to understand. And some of you may go, hey man, it'd be great if you could kind of give us an orientation, because I'm in the car and I don't know how far we're going or where we're going. And if you could give me a heads up on what the next 30 minutes looks like, that would help me a lot. So a heads up on the next 30 minutes is I'm going to give you a couple of practical tools around what it looks like to not only do what Mike and I just did, but that requires a really intentional container with people who can be safe and hold space. But what can you do, practically speaking, in the moment? We'll go over some things that are that you don't need anything other than what you already have available to you now to do that. But then also we want to spend the last 20 minutes and about 10 minutes from now trying to answer as many of those questions that you guys have been so intentional about sending in, that Amy's been cataloging for us on a document in the background here. So 10 minutes of some practical tools, some orientation to what it looks like to be able to do that in the everyday world. And then we'll answer some Q&A. Cool. All righty. So that being said, we're talking about what can you do on a daily basis. The first thing that I want to share with you guys is what's called the 6 basics. And the 6 basics is the thing that if you were a human being, and I don't say this lightly, let me rephrase, 50% of the people who come to see me, and to give you context, 70% of my patients are from out of state. I am a $400 an hour clinical session. Next year will be $500. It's a first time I'm doing a rate change in 5 years, and I feel viscerally uncomfortable doing it. But people keep telling me it's worthwhile because I have a 5-month wait list. So I am in a space where 5-month wait list, $400 to $500 an hour, 70% of the people that come to see me are from out of state. That's a very concierge practice. And why I say that, not to aggrandize, but to qualify this next statement, 50% of the people who come to see me would have a full resolution of everything that they are dealing with if they did the 6 basics. You do not need to travel from another country to see me 50% of the time if you do the 6 basics. Okay, so you ready? It's not going to be rocket surgery, but it's important because then the question becomes, are you doing this on a regular basis? You may be aware of it, but that's different than applying it, right? Self-awareness and application are 2 different things, right? So the 6 basics are to breathe, right? Which I'm not doing, so I'm going to breathe, to hydrate, to sleep, to rest, to eat, and to move. And here's a couple of bullet points that are really important with this, okay? Breathing, you can only go without. Most people can only effectively hold their breath for between 20 and 30 seconds before they start getting uncomfortable. You cannot go long without breathing. But for most of us, when we're on autopilot, I don't want you to think about how much you've been breathing throughout the day. I want you to think, when's the last time before this conversation where Mike prompted you or I'm prompting you? When is the last time you paused and intentionally took a deep breath, even a single one? How many times during the day do you stop, put all of your focus and attention on a single deep breath? Most people will do an intentional deep breath 1 to 2 times a week where their focus is only on the breath. I'm talking about doing 1 deep breath per hour, starting with 1 deep breath per day, not a 30-minute breathing exercise. You have to become the expert in deep breathing quality exercises. I'm talking just becoming aware that you're breathing on purpose. And think about it this way. If you're in a relationship with somebody that you know how that person feels about you, and you've been doing life with them for 10 years, but they pause, they stop, they look you in the eye and they go, hey, this is what you mean to me, or this is what our relationship means to me. How many times do they have to do that a day or a week or a month or a year for it to matter? It's not the fact that you don't know that in the context of the relationship, it's the intent that changes, right? So intentional breathing. Second thing is that the number one conversation that our brain has globally across the board is movement. Movement is the only sensory system that is fully online in utero. We actually think of taste, touch, sight, sound, and smell. Your brain can actually lose all 5 of those senses and it will figure it out. It's amazing. But if you lose your relationship with gravity and movement, your brain will start to die. So I would look at Blue Zones, bluezones.com. It's great studies that show what's the common theme for people who live to be 100 centenarians and Blue Zones. What's the common theme? There are a couple of things, but the only core common theme across the board is activities of regular daily movement. It's not even exercise, y'all. It's just walking. It's just having a conversation with gravity, right? The difference between sleep and rest is sleep is unintentional, rest is intentional. Because any of you who struggle with sleep, tell me how well you fall asleep trying to go to sleep. Does that work for you? Because I can tell you, I've wrestled with sleep for a long time and trying harder. I am an expert in trying to go to sleep. Okay. But getting to sleep is involuntary. The less you try to sleep, the more effectively you actually fall asleep. You don't choose to wake, you don't choose to go to sleep. So sleep is this space of curating and cultivating a container that really does sleep hygiene. Some of the apps that I recommend that are really helpful for sleep hygiene are Better Sleep. That's a fantastic one. Ones that help you when you're doing rest, which is carving out a few minutes in your day where you're choosing to be intentional about doing less. Resting is decreasing the number of stimuli. Maybe resting for you is driving slower, right? When you're stimulated, maybe it's changing your relationship with how much noise is in the space, how much you're on a screen. What can you do to calm something down on purpose? Change the speed, change the volume, change the stimuli, bring the intensity down just a touch, okay? So in that situation with rest, options that you can do are Headspace, Calm, Insight Timer. Better Sleep has some really good options for free meditations, so those are great. So we did breathe, we did move, sleep, and rest. Easiest way to do the hydration, and forgive me if that background noise came through, guys. I'm on Do Not Disturb, but for some reason my computer just decided to not care. But when we do hydrate, I want you to just think of your body weight. If you're in a metric-based system, just convert it to U.S. standard. But if it's in ounces, you want to take your body weight and drink that many ounces. Take half your body weight and drink that many ounces of water. So I'm 290. I don't look it, but I promise that's what the scale says. I'm a big guy. So if I'm drinking an adequate amount of water, really what my body needs based on my mass, 140 to 150 ounces is good, right? That would be great. And that's it's about just over 3 liters. So that can be a helpful measure, but we want to drink. Here's the thing. You're probably not going to drink too much water, but the cool thing is if you drink more water, you know what you're going to have to do at some point. You're probably going to have to get up and move so that you can go to the restroom. So drinking water will kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And then the last one is to eat. And when I say eat, this is a really complex conversation that we're not going to dig into in 5 minutes. But the 2 bullet points that I always say to folks is ask yourself what your relationship with food is. And then a really helpful approach is to think about an anti-inflammatory diet, because most of us as human beings in the world nowadays are pretty inflamed. There's so much stress, there's so much intensity. So an anti-inflammatory diet can be very helpful. But the bigger thing that I would start with is asking, what's your relationship with food? And if you eat too little, it's actually not about the quality of food that you're eating, it's the quantity. And if you eat too much, it's actually not about the quality of food, it's about the quantity. But if you eat an appropriate amount during the day, then you have a really great opportunity to change the quality of what you're eating. But if it's too little, focus on quantity. If it's too much, focus on quantity. And then if you eat an appropriate amount for your body type during the day, then maybe consider a change in the quality of food. Because again, we want to have an intentional relationship. And a really great book for that is Savor by Thich Nhat Hanh. That allows you to be really intentional when you eat. Because if you're intentional with your food while you're eating, it actually completely changes the way that your food is digested by your body. So that example there of the 6 basics is one video in a self-care course that I have available that is around how we do sustainable self-care. And in that space, it's talking through a lot of these topics. What happens when I feel completely stressed and my body shuts down? Do I even know how my brain works when I deal with a perceived stress, like what happened on the highway for me yesterday, or what happens for Mike when he used to have panic attacks? So it is important for us to go with practical applications. But first and foremost, it doesn't really matter how well you're doing at everything else if you're not hydrated, right? A lot of the times we may be dealing with anxiety and depression, and it's actually just fatigue. So we're getting massive treatments around these clinical depressive or clinical anxiety-based disorders. But what it actually is we're hungry. We don't have enough fuel. So we got to put some gas in our tank. We got to hydrate. We got to rest, slow down, give our body a chance to decrease the intensity of what we're going through. And then maybe it's an opportunity to just do a pit stop and protect our sleep a little bit more. So that's just an example of where I wanted to lean into, practically speaking, for the sake of the time that we have, is to really lean into do the basics. And again, without any exaggeration, 50% of the people that come to see me could get everything that they're working through resolved if they go, what is my relationship with those things that Jerome just mentioned? And could I be a bit more intentional about that, right? So that being said, I'm curious, Mike, I'm going to take some deep breaths and give everybody a chance to catch up. Is there anything that you found either in your experience with me or in some of your own work that you could share with everybody that feels like it might be universally practical in terms of self-care and coherence?
Yeah, yeah, that's a wonderful question. And when you were speaking of all the way back at the beginning about breathing and about starting not by being a 30-minute a day breathing master, but even like starting with taking one intentional breath a day. That's something that I catch myself in. There's sometimes when I feel like I'm in such a rush to get through the next thing and the next thing and the next thing in my life, that sometimes I stop to breathe deeply, and I even do a quick check. I'm like, do I have time to do this? And then I think, wow, what a question that even is, that I feel like I don't even have time to pause and to take a deep and substantial breath. And so important. Um, Thankfully, the nature of my work from home, hydration is the one I have most dialed in out of any of these by far. I'm always drinking water. So, like, okay, well, at least I've got that one going on. And developing a better relationship with eating is something that that I've really embarked on in a different way this past year, actually working with a wonderful Chinese medicine person here in town who does not believe in any prescriptive diets whatsoever, but believes in us developing a more intuitive relationship with our bodies and eating what nourishes us. And like, so far I've been able to release almost 30 pounds this year following, some of this guidance, which is very similar to what you offer in your course on the 6 basics.
Yeah.
So yeah, and movement, for me, what I've discovered is that swimming is so helpful for whatever my sensory processing issues are, the kind of bilateral stimulation of stroking through the water, then combined with the positive proprioception of weight training. That like when I do those two things on a regular basis, I've never considered myself an athlete. I'm a nerd. I'm often in front of a desk, but getting in the water and even spending 15 minutes with weights after I swim 3 or 4 times a week just makes such a difference in my mental health and my ability to be present. So
Yeah.
I definitely want to revisit your teachings on rest, because that's the one, as I mentioned, that's been a little challenging lately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love you shared that because this is one of the things that I have found, and I appreciate everybody's patience who is having a first time introduction with me, because sometimes it can be like there's a lot happening here. Is there a way that I can understand this where I could hit pause and maybe there's a visual and maybe there's something that helps me to understand it more collectively. This is the whole reason that we ended up making the self-care course, because all of the videos that are in there are just me answering these questions because nobody can help me answer these questions. But then we start going through in interweaving and intertwining these ideas that why does a change in relationship with gravity change my relationship with depression or my emotional health? Emotional health is always about being elevated or depressed. So if I'm depressed, no one who's truly depressed has wild energy. That's anxiety. So I feel less energized. I feel like I'm buried or I'm weighed down. So then you can take literally in the world of functional neurology, you can take any topic across the board globally. If you find a literal way to engage that concept, you can activate that conversation. So if we're saying, I'm trying to have a conversation with how I manage what I feel like I'm carrying in my heart, you can go, okay, that's a conversation in terms of how my system responds to weight. So if I do a conversation like swimming and I'm a little bit less weighted, I'm in fact weightless to a more significant, like float tanks or swimming, then I can have an opportunity, even if it doesn't resolve all the things in my life that I'm depressed about, because depression is a relevant clinical thing. I have wrestled with it for 2 decades. Okay. You're talking to somebody who has attempted suicide twice. This is a conversation I fully understand. Somebody had told me, hey, the way that you can feel physically like you're not carrying so much is why don't you go for a swim? And then be intent and be aware that when you get out of the pool, you're going to all of a sudden feel a completely different experience with gravity. And can you be present to the fact that you feel like you're carrying less in your body, and then you get out of the water and you're carrying more? And can you just check in with that? Can you just recognize that your body has the capacity to carry more because you walked from the pool to the locker room or to the place where you were able to change and shower or get back in your car? So I have the capacity to bear weight. I have the capacity to handle gravitas and heavy things. But then what does it look like for me to build some stamina with my ability to carry heavy things by actually carrying heavy things? Literally, right? So whatever the concept is, give yourself a literal context of a physical experience doing something similar. Like if you wrestle with anxiety and you feel unstable all the time, sit on your chair like you are now and go, do I feel like I'm going to fall? Does it feel certain that I am in my seat? Does it feel like I'm going to lose my balance? No. So, do I have some place in my life, somewhere in my body, somewhere in my experience that I'm not falling down, that everything doesn't feel unstable? Can I hold on to some physical truth that I haven't changed my relationship with what's going to happen and what I'm concerned about? But anxiety is concerned about an unforeseen issue or an experience that hasn't yet occurred. Anxiety is always future tense, always. So if you're trying to give yourself some sort of guarantee around certainty and stability, start by in your chair and just going, do I feel steady and stable. If you're safe enough to do it, stand up and go, if I close my eyes, do I feel unstable? Great, then that might be too much for my system. I don't want to introduce anxiety. So I sit back down and I get a gauge that there is a place somewhere in my life that I can feel stable, somewhere. Because I can't guarantee that I can change everything on a webinar with Mike to make your life stable. But if you recognize that giving your body an opportunity and your brain an opportunity to recognize that you can find stability somewhere allows your brain to go, so you're saying there's a chance. Yes, I'm saying there's a chance, okay? And just for closing the loop, the depression piece is changing a relationship with what you carry. The anxiety piece is changing a relationship with stability. The body piece is always being present. The body piece is almost exclusively unconscious. So if you wrestle with panic attacks or body-based symptoms or sensory processing disorders, finding some way, somewhere that you can be present to what's happening in your body and knowing that you're safe. One of the ways that I recommend for folks to do it is, if you guys can do this with me, if you put your hands together, and then what you do is you interlock your fingers, just whatever feels normal, and then just check in what thumb is on top. Some of you it's going to be left, some of you it's going to be right. Put your hands back together and put the other hand on top. Switch hands and then see what comes up. Okay, type it into the chat if you want to, because everybody has a different experience. Now, some of you might have already let your hands go. If you haven't, go back to this position, go into your familiar space, and check in what immediately came up for you. Take a deep breath. Some of you might have breathed immediately. Go back to neutral and go to the unfamiliar, unpracticed location and see what comes up for you. Does it feel weird? Does it feel gross? Does it feel unfamiliar? Does it feel wrong? Go back to neutral. Go back to your familiar practice place and see how quickly you feel a felt sense of comfort, right? This is like body-based EMDR. You can literally get a gauge on whether or not you feel safe in your own body just using your own hands, right? It feels weird because it's unpracticed. And this is the thing that I would tell you in the body-based space, regardless of where you are in the spectrum in terms of how you engage or where your body is in body spectrums, which is wide. If you can have a safe encounter where you can recognize that it's not that you're unsafe, it's that it's unfamiliar. It's not that it's unhealthy, it's that it's unpracticed. And that you have an opportunity to engage discomfort without it becoming trauma, then you can start to build resilience, right? So going from my familiar position to my unfamiliar position physically, just with my hands, builds body-based resilience. Even if I don't understand cognitively how it works, I can feel the shift from less comfortable to more comfortable, and that's all I need. Does that make sense? Cool. So, and Lavetta, the playback will be made available. We'll probably email it out tomorrow, okay? Because I just glanced at the chat. Sorry. And Amy's laughing at me because she was answering it. And I'm on autopilot. So what we're going to do for the last few minutes, and if any of you need to leave, please feel free. You have the grace to go ahead and step away. There will be a replay. You'll be able to get that. The replay will include these Q&As. But we will go until we've answered the questions that are currently here. But at this point, I would have to let everybody know we wouldn't be able to take any additional questions. So all the questions that have come in are the ones that we're going to be able to answer because the way that I'm wired, we'll answer all of them, okay? Mike, anything that you wanted to add or anything that you wanted to name in what was just shared before I answer the questions? I don't want to run through the last 20 minutes without an opportunity to check in with you.
Yeah, no, not at all. I think that you said it well, and these good people have been waiting for responses to these questions. So I feel like we should dive right in.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. And for all of you who've been waiting for questions, I appreciate it. This is an active practice for me to wait until the end to answer the questions. And I almost got all the way through the webinar without doing it until I answered about the replay. So I'm going to count that as a win. Terry asked a question about will we be talking about the various Enneagram types. We did intersect that in a bit, just a high level piece. When we talk about heart center, that's the intelligence center really related to the right brain and emotional intelligence. When we talk about the head center, that's the left brain and that analytical kind of mental intelligence. And then the gut center is that body-based physical health encounter. So that's really that. But for the Enneagram stuff, man, there's so much content and resources through podcasts and other e-courses and books on the website. And also feel free to send us an email at info@drjerome.com, that if you missed the webinar that we did last month on the Enneagram, we'd be happy to send you the replay on that. Okay. So next question, which I'll let you answer first, Mike, and then I'll answer, is, are we both believers in Jesus Christ?
Yes.
And what is your answer to that, Mike?
I would say that the short answer is yes. And the longer answer is, it depends on what you mean by Jesus Christ. It's interesting to consider what it means to believe. And it's also an interesting question of who is the I who is doing the believing. And it's probably outside the scope of our time here today. But so if you want 100%. A simple answer, it's yes. And then the more complex answer is getting into the weeds.
I love it. Yeah. Also, Mike wrote this book called Divine Dance. It's really, really good. He wrote it with a guy named Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr's got a few things to say on Jesus. So does Mike. Highly recommend, if you guys came through this channel through my content, to subscribe to Mike's email. He sends so much good quality information that his newsletters and his emails will give you an incredible amount of content to digest and understand in complex conversations. My answer is yes, I believe in Jesus Christ. My biggest thing around Jesus is, I think that most people answer questions around what they think Jesus would do. What would Jesus do? And I think our entire world would be a little bit different if we asked ourselves the question, what did Jesus do? Because there's good examples, and that would eliminate quite a bit of debates and contention if we actually considered what the personhood and the example of Jesus actually did, not what we think Jesus would have done. So yes, believer in Jesus. Also a very complex conversation. Next question, I'll answer first. I'd love to hear your answer, Steve. It's from Steve. Yes. I'd like to hear your answer, Mike. My definition of spirituality is actually the coherence piece. So when I say physical, mental, emotional, relational health, and spiritual health, I think of mind, body, and soul. Mental is mind, emotional is heart, physical is body. The relationship, the perichoresis, the dance between those is the intersection of them, but them collectively is the spiritual cohesion or the spiritual coherence. So I think you can't have spirituality unless you take into consideration mind, body, and soul and their interconnectedness, their perichoretic intersections. I also don't think you can understand spirituality if you don't take into consideration physical, mental, emotional, and relational health. That is my definition of spirituality. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, love that. Love that. Mine is different, but certainly complementary. I would say it's the art of reunion with spirit, with self, with each other, and with our world around us. I think that one of the biggest existential deficits we're facing these days is a felt sense of alienation and disconnection. And for me, healthy spirituality are the roadmaps to get to know myself better, to get to know all of you wonderful people better, to get to know the world better. And then through that, to get to know ultimate reality, ultimate concern, divine intelligence, divine beneficence, however it is that we understand spirit.
Love it. It's so good. And, I think this is a thing that this is where we really have the opportunity, whether it's sustainable self-care, whether it's the conversation that's Mike's having, my experience as a clinician and a patient. If we realize that spirituality is the experience of physical, mental, and emotional health, then we're talking that there are it's going to be 8 billion by the end of the decade. There are 8 billion versions of spirituality, right? Because spirituality is the collective container of the individual experience, right? So you can have a spiritual encounter, but spirituality is so relative. I have an identical twin brother. We grew up in the same womb. I didn't get my own bed until I was 11. Our encounters were very similar. Our experiences were very different. So I think the gift of spirituality is to know the concepts are the same. The context and the experiences are completely different. And that's okay. That's okay. We had another question quickly, which I won't go into too deeply, but somebody asked, is it possible to help a child who's lost half their brain in utero? My nephew lost an identical twin boy, which hits home for me very much. And the other one was born with half a brain. Doctors believe a stroke caused both. He is 10 and doing amazing, but would love to help. So I want to answer that question, but also give everybody that's listening an example of why this is so relevant, okay? I live in a world as a clinician where every single person that has come to me has been told that they are too broken. I was told that I'm too broken, right? Whether it's a spiritual container, it's a clinical container, it's an enneagrammatic container, it's a relational, I don't care what your background is. A lot of us are wrestling with how do I reconcile my brokenness, right? I, in my world at the clinic, hear that question and go, what can I do to make an impact on that? And I believe something's possible until their body proves otherwise. But I will assume that something can change. So the answer to that is, if somebody said, hey, I've got a child that's missing a hemisphere, what can we do? We can actually do a lot, because I understand the integration between the brain and the body. So if that's a 10-year-old that's doing amazing, that's a 10-year-old with a lot to work with. So now we don't move into construction, we move into performance and optimization, and we give them a chance to be even more efficient. Because you know what? If they're riding around with a car with 2 flat tires, then maybe we can figure out how to put them onto a bicycle rather than a car, and they have a great experience because they're built for 2 wheels and not 4. Right. So maybe it's not an issue with the vehicle, it's an issue with the application. But why that matters for you guys is, how many times have you been told that there's too much missing, that there isn't enough resources, so something is broken in you? That ethos is quintessentially flawed if we are going to heal, if we're going to move towards wholeness. So all of the work that I'm doing in terms of coherence is saying, this isn't about being less broken, it's about becoming more whole. And even in what Mike and I shared with you today, that's a process, right? It's a journey, not a destination. So that being said, a couple of you asked, will the recording be shared? It will, later tonight or tomorrow. And then you can watch back, hit pause, go for a water break, move around, maybe take a nap. All of those things are good there too. And then Brenda asked, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, Mike. I have been hearing that quote unquote alignment is a lot more of heart and mind coherence. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. It's a lot more of heart and mind coherence. I guess if I'm understanding it on a surface level, then I agree. And it's interesting because one of the Eastern Orthodox understandings of prayer is the dropping of the mind into the heart. There are some contemporary organizations like HeartSync that show us how to both look at our breathing as well as intentional affection, what some people might call it, like in Buddhism, a metta meditation or a loving kindness meditation, ways to allow our minds and our hearts to co-inhere, to cooperate with each other as we are experiencing gratitude and as we're centering ourselves. So Brenda, if that's at least part of what you mean, then I agree, and it's a wonderful adjunct to the title of our webinar today.
Yeah, and I love the intuitiveness that you had there, because I think in terms of that alignment that question was around is if we can get, because remember, coherence is like harmony and sync. So if you get your head and your heart in sync and you're in alignment, do you have more coherence? Yeah, you really want to be able to be in a situation where you're singing not only on the same song sheet, but at the same time, the same tempo, the same key. Timing is very important, right? So this alignment around head and heart is oftentimes really a conversation around pace and around sync. So like we said, walking is nothing more than a controlled series of falls. It's a lot less about balance and a lot more about rhythm. So sometimes we can just find that rhythm that allows us to do that. And interestingly enough, again, the literal answer is in there. If I say you got to find a rhythm in your body, what tends to be the first thing that people think about? It's a heart rhythm. So not only heart sync, but heart math. Both of those are really good ways to go, how can I get more awareness around my physical heart and change my head and heart coherence cognitively? Really fancy stuff. Really cool. Marty, I appreciate your question and your comment. I'm going to just summarize that quickly if you're still with us. Marty was just sharing that he's had different stages of life that he's gone through. He's 84 and had a share of a lot of things that he's been able to experience in terms of stages of wholeness and ego and wholeness staging. And just wanted to share, that a lot of the times our life is stuck in these unconscious ego bias, and finding out that wholeness and holiness are kind of on the same thread. And he even mentions that Richard Rohr has been able to explain this a lot, and obviously Mike's explained that as well in the Divine Dance. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And then David asked a question: does self-care import comfort as an antidote to anxiety, and if so, why? Does self-care import or infuse comfort as an antidote to anxiety, and why? It does. And this is the interesting thing, like the course that we've been talking about that's available on my website, the entire theme, the perspective that it was done through, for there's 21 videos, 6.5 hours of content, and a ton of visuals. And in almost every visual or in every video, there's a concept of a bear and a deadline. And why I say that is your brain can't tell the difference between an actual life-threatening situation and a perceived one. So if a bear is chasing you in the woods, your anxiety is going to go through the roof about what's going to happen next. Well, what happens if you get an email from somebody, or you get a phone call and the caller ID pops up for somebody on a different side of the planet, but you have a negative container and negative context for that person? What happens? So if we can't tell the difference between a bear and a deadline, like a project that's due, one of the amazing things that we can do is go, what does it look like for me to do the breathing? If the only thing that I did was go, because if I'm running from a bear in the woods, what's the chances that I'm going to stop and have a meal? What's the chances that I'm going to use the bathroom? What's the chances that I'm going to stop and drink that cup of water that Mike's got on his desk? What's the chance that I'm going to finish another cup of coffee, but I should probably go for more water, right? All of the things that we're doing in the 6 basics, what's the chances that we're going to stop and have a really good restorative nap or night's sleep? We can't do that if we're running from a bear called our spouse or our kids or our job or COVID or stress. So every time that we do self-care, we're infusing a felt sense of safety. And that's the whole point of the content, is finding safety, because self-care isn't sustainable unless we feel safe enough to reproduce it. So the key is we have to start by saying there are no bears. There's a difference between your actual life being threatened and your way of life being threatened. The actual life being threatened versus your way of life being threatened. Those are 2 different things. Okay. Bernil, the neurofeedback work, I do neurofeedback work in the clinic. There's a lot there. But for the sake of what we have left in terms of the container, I'm going to skip over that and just tell you, I think some books that are really helpful for neurofeedback work that I love are The Wisdom of Your Body by Hilary McBride. The idea of the Cultural Somatics Institute by Resmaa Menakem. I think neurofeedback is also tied into all Dan Siegel's work for interpersonal neurobiology. And then this guy named Dr. Jerome has some stuff too. So neurofeedback is great. But that, what you just did with your hands, by the way, that's neurofeedback. You changed something in terms of your central nervous system and your body told you something about it. So you changed your brain and you got feedback. So even that is practical neurofeedback. And then somebody asked, I've had generalized anxiety for 5 years since being given 1 dose of steroids, and I can't seem to lose it. That's, first off, thank you for sharing that. I work with a lot of folks that have had one negative experience. The biggest thing that I would recommend in that, if you're still on the webinar with us, is when you have a steroid component and you have a really strong anxiety, it changed your relationship between inflammation and trying to dampen inflammation. So a lot of it is in what's called your brain sim or your vagal system. So I can't give you clinical advice in this setting. I would recommend going to ACNB, AdamCharlieNancyBravo.org, and you can look for a provider that may be in your area. That's my degree. But 2 really great books for everybody on this call, but specifically for the gentleman that asked that question, is both of those books are by Deb Dana, Dana. One is called Anchored, and the other one is 50 Exercises for Connection. And both of their books are fantastic, because if you can do things like gargling and breathing and changing the temperature of your shower, it can be really, really helpful for calming down that generalized anxiety, because your body got a huge shock. We got to figure out how to kind of stabilize things, because it feels like the volume got turned up and nobody managed to turn the volume back down, and those books can help with that. Okay. Everybody take a deep breath with me. We're getting there. Almost done. Just a couple more questions. Appreciate everybody's patience. All right. So somebody asked, thoughts on IFS and compassionate injury, or I'm sorry, well, that was my fault. I said injury. Compassion, because it's injuries, right? My fault. I'm going to back up. Thoughts on IFS and compassionate inquiry by Gabor Mate. I love Gabor's stuff. I love IFS's stuff. I think, for the sake of the time on this call as well, if you guys are not familiar with Gabor Mate, Gabormate, looks like Gabor Mate. and also Richard Schwartz's work. No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz is fantastic. Compassion and Inquiry and the Whole Process by Gabor Mate, incredibly good things. Gabor actually had a, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say with IFS or internal family systems, I actually just completed a beautiful dialogue with a friend of both Dr. Jerome's and I, Dr. Simona Cetescu-Wyke on IFS. And if you go onto mysticsummit.com, you'll be able to watch that for free in a couple weeks. So it's a lovely dialogue about internal family systems.
Oh, that's awesome. And yes, Simona is incredible. So I'm a huge fan. She's not a twin, is she, Mike?
I don't think so.
Something in my brain thought she was a twin. But yeah, IFS and Gabor Mate's work is brilliant. So huge fan. And a lot of my work around the brain-based Enneagram and whole identity work and sustainable self-care is actually very, very rooted in the framework of IFS. So huge fan of it. All right, folks, everybody take a deep breath. We are almost there. I am going to keep my agreement and my commitment. There is only 2 questions left. So if you send in a question after these last 2, thank you so much for the grace to not answer those today, because I am learning to maintain the boundaries. So we've got 2 questions left, which one was, I'm a mother with young children who has bipolar and OCD, but it doesn't always require medication. I was medicated the second pregnancy and had some stressful home experiences, especially after my son was born. I've noticed a strong connection between my emotions and my son's. I noticed him gulping when I feel stressed and burping when I relax, seeming to react to my feelings and facial expressions even when he can't see me. What resources are available to heal as a family? What a great question. And what a transparent share. Thank you for that. It was an anonymous person, so I hope you're still here listening. But for everybody who's listening to that going, well, I don't have a relationship with bipolar or OCD, I don't have a child. How can I relate to that particular question and heal as a person in relationship to what this mother shared? This is quintessentially the framework of mirror neurons, is what is your brain mirroring in relationship to another? So resources that are really helpful to heal this is exactly a scenario where IFS is very helpful. Because when we show up in a certain way and one of the phrases that I use for everybody is when we get triggered, all of us are 7 years old until proven otherwise, or until somebody older and more mature steps in. So a lot of the times that we're in those spaces, it's really important for us to be able to recognize what age we are, right? So a phrase that you can use as the mother in this situation or as an adult in a space where you get triggered is to ask yourself, does this make sense if I was 7? Does it make sense if I was 10? Does it make sense on a particular age? And as soon as you ask yourself that question, it automatically becomes relevant to that time and automatically lets you know that you're not that age. So it gives you a context and it helps you to localize where you are. But resources for healing that in a family, especially because there's so much mirroring and there's so much codependency in that space, is I think there's really a really good one is Whole Brain Child and No Drama Discipline by Dan Siegel. Both of those are very, very helpful for navigating, understanding how your brain was built and how the brain of your baby and your child was built. So thank you for sharing that. It was really, really helpful. All right, folks, we're at the last question and I'm only 7 minutes over. I feel good about that. I'm just naming that, okay? Linda asks, hey, I forget to breathe. I believe you and I can relate. I forget to breathe, finding that I've been holding my breath when upset or stressed, especially. It even makes my chest, neck, shoulders, or throat hurt. I noticed, recognize, and name this, but do you have any thoughts on how to come back to breathing? Yes. And this is the last kind of container that I'll give you that works for everybody. And then I'd love for Mike and I to just share what our experience has been with each other and land the plane here. But here's a hard and fast truth that you can have as a human being for when you encounter a trigger, which is stress, effort, work, anything where you're expending energy, right? It's costing you something. Even fireworks aren't cheap, and fireworks are fun for some people. Fireworks are also terrifying for some people. So I forget to breathe when I'm doing this because I'm excited, I'm engaged, and I'm working through a lot of things. So it doesn't mean necessarily that something's wrong, but my body is triggered to move faster in this conversation. So when we go through this container, if something is happening where I'm expending energy, I'm taking effort to shut down and stay shut down. I'm taking effort to get big and energetic. It doesn't matter where you fall on the introversion to extroversion spectrum, you're putting in work, okay? So if you start to get triggered the first thing that I want you to be able to consider is whether or not you are aware of what's happening, because you cannot come back to your breath if you don't recognize that you have a breath at all. So if we get triggered, the first step is to recognize that we've got a trigger, or that we're feeling the effort of what it is that we're doing. We're connecting to our relationship of what's happening in real time. We're recognizing it. Then you choose a response, not the right response, not the appropriate response. You're reminding yourself that you have choice, you have agency, you get into the driver's seat. And then you start to foster and cultivate an opportunity to recover, because you can't choose to be triggered. You also can't choose the nature of exactly how you recover. Those are things that are in a lot of times out of our control. But I can choose to respond when I become aware of what's happening, and then I can foster and cultivate an increased chance of recovery. Does that make sense? So if I get triggered and I forget to breathe, oh, I just realized I'm holding my breath. I've recognized it. I get a chance to respond. How do I want to respond? There are no bears. Nobody's going to be frustrated that we're still going until 5:40. It's okay. I'm checking in with that. Nobody's mad at me. I feel triggered. That's not a negative. Okay, I'm recognizing that something's coming up for me. I'm aware of it. I chose to respond and breathe again, and maybe I need to breathe again, and maybe I need to breathe again. And eventually we start to cultivate and foster the space where we go, I'm feeling a little bit more safe. And as I start to feel a little bit more safe, I start to recover in different ways, because it isn't about being safe. It's about moving towards safety, or having that trigger and that harm or that danger distance itself from you. So you can either distance yourself from the trigger, or you can feel like you're moving towards a felt sense of safety. And either way, it will cultivate recovery. So trigger, recognize, respond, and then recover. Okay. That's all the questions that we have. So I will invite everybody to take a deep breath. I'm going to do the same, and then we'll land the plane here. Good times. Mike, how are you doing, man? You are not unfamiliar with my fire hose, with my commentary. Just checking in with you, man. How are you doing? What's coming up for you? Where are you at as we finish this conversation and this dialogue? And thank you again for being here with me. It's such a gift.
Of course. I'm good. I'm feeling a lot of renewed gratitude, as you were able to share, and I was able to share, both some of our recent challenges. It was just an opportunity to kind of stop and take stock in our shared humanity, and even just being reminded of the six basics of, like, okay, yes, I can get back on this horse, and then nothing that I'm currently experiencing, even though some of it is quite sad for me and sometimes quite overwhelming for me when I consider the limitations that I still face, to know that we have the tools, we have the capacity for resilience. I feel grateful for that. And I just feel grateful for your friendship, and that you and I have been able to open up this space here today for so many others to consider the tools and the inner resources that they already possess to begin taking these steps towards a whole life coherence.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And recognizing and acknowledging all the work that you've done, right? That nobody sees. So much of the self-care journey is very lonely, right? It's like being a leader. If you're a good leader, even if you're a bad leader, 90% of what you do, no one sees.
Yeah.
And when you're doing the journey of self-care, it's self-leadership, and it's a very lonely thing. That's why I think a lot of people don't do it, is because it's hard to do work and not have everyone recognize how much it takes, right?
And I want to encourage anyone listening. Sometimes you probably don't only have to be high in Enneagram 2 to sometimes maybe even feel guilty for the idea of self-care, or the idea
100%.
of I've been working on myself for 20 years and it has cost resources and time, and, like, aren't we supposed to be selfless, especially if we're in certain religious interpretations? But as a dear friend of mine likes to say, you can't pour from an empty cup. And as Me Without You likes to scream in their emo sort of way, a glass can only spill what it contains. And so it's worth, taking time to fill your cup. First of all, because you yourself are absolutely worth it. And then
100%.
secondly, if you're oriented, as so many of us on this call are, toward lives of service, well, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first. So I'm unapologetic about the time and resources that I expend on myself for proper self-care, because I believe in what I do in the world. And I believe in what you do in the world, as well as who you are inherently when you aren't doing a blessed thing.
Yeah. And I love that. And thank you for the intersection in that disruptive space, because that actually helps a lot. Because you can feel the thread where I introduce a little bit of this hesitancy to go, gosh, it can be lonely, but then at the same time, it's one of those things where you're like, sometimes every once in a while, you just got to go, I'm doing a really, really damn good job. And I love it. I'm unapologetic about the work that I'm doing. That is going to be my takeaway for the day. I'm going to try and be unapologetic about the work that I'm doing, because I tend to lead with an apology of how I feel or how I've made people feel. So that spoke volumes to me. Thank you for that. Truthfully, truly. So I will land this with you, everybody, and then we will call it a day or a night or a morning, depending on where in the world you are.
Yes.
That the nature of this wholeness and this whole life coherence and coming into sync with ourselves, mind, body, and soul, relationally and spiritually, it isn't about being less broken. It's about becoming more whole. And remember, in some of these spaces, especially if some of you in the questions that you asked, it isn't about always resolving hurt, because sometimes that doesn't happen. Mike and I have shared that we're still working through resolving some of the things that in our system cause pain or cause hurt. And the reality is, it's not about hurting less, it's about recovering faster, but also recovering effectively. So I hope this time has been meaningful for you in terms of supporting you in the journey of healing and journey towards improved and sustainable self-care. And if any of this is worthwhile, meaningful for you, and you would like more information, please feel free to go to my website, which is drjerome.com, just drjerome.com. We've got a really comprehensive self-care course there that we would love to share with you. That costs less than 1 clinical hour with me. So instead of coming from another state or another country, that's a really good start, and it'll get you a ton of resources. So if that feels like something that you'd like to jump into, invite you to do that. But otherwise, we will be doing more webinars. We got another one coming next month. Might even have Mike jump in at some point again and just throw us some bombs. So thank you again, Mike, for being here, and thank you for the opportunity to be with each of you. And if you made it all the way through this in the replay, we love you too. We hope you guys have an amazing night. Take care.